morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you here at the South Louis Community College for the first in a series of 2 seminars hosted by VALIRI, which is the Vaughan A Institute of Research, as well as the South Louis Community College, with 2 of our very treasured alumni. Today, we will hear a presentation from Dr. Drexler James, but the engine behind this for a while has been Dr. Vaughan A, who continues to do cancer research in St. Lucia. And we will get right into it, and we will invite Dr. Vaughan A to do the introduction.
Right, so thank you for that. Vaughan A is a professor of epidemiology in the Department of Epi at McGill University. It's a great pleasure here to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. James, affectionately known as Drexler. Drexler is from Jackmill, small town in St. Lucian Castries, and he's a graduate of the Roseau Combined School, the St. Mary's College, and the South Louis Community College. He was a PhD in social psychology from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he's currently an assistant professor of psychology in the University of Minnesota, where he studies social and psychological factors that influence health. So without further ado, I give you Drexler.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for the introductions. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I've been meaning to give a talk in St. Lucia for so many years, so thank you for the invitation. As it were, the talk is generally a reintroduction to psychology and I guess an argument for why we need more research psychologists in St. Lucia. But before I begin the presentation, I have just, I guess, one question for the audience. What is psychology? What is your understanding of what psychology as a field is, what it entails? Yeah, trying to understand the human brain, cognition, and behavior. Anyone else? Yeah, that captures the definition, actually. So psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. Here we have William Wundt, who's the father of psychology as we know it. And so the goals of psychology is to describe behavior. What are the psychological determinants of factors that explains why people engage in whatever behavior they engage in, understanding the cause, predicting outcomes, and how do we modify behavior. So for example, I know Suzanne just brought up cancer. And so one example might be understanding why men might or might not go for colon cancer screening. You know, what are the cultural factors that might explain why men don't seek care? It might be ideas of masculinity. What are some of the causes? We can think of like structural barriers. And can we design interventions to increase screening rates among men in St. Lucia specifically? Okay, and so that was like an overview of psychology. And so what is research psychology, more specifically? Anyone? Research psychology? An academic discipline, area of inquiry. Anyone else? There's the wrong answer. Like,
research of behaviors and methods.
Yeah, conducting research on the behavior and like cognitions. And so, yeah, and so research in psychology involves the scientific study of behavior through systematic observation, experimentation, and analysis. And so what we're doing in research psychology is injecting the psychological method into the study of human behavior. And so here we might ask some research questions, so we'll go into more concrete examples later today in the presentation. We might conduct a study, data analysis, draw conclusions, build on theory to understand human behavior, and we just like continue this process. And so research psychology involves hypothesis testing. And to a lot of people's surprise, there's a lot of statistics involved in psychology, research psychology specifically. Oftentimes students are surprised that they have to take a statistics course for psych major, and most people shift or change majors when they get to statistics. So I always think that's like an interesting thing. Okay, and so why research in psychology matters, or research it informs evidence-based practice. So research psychology provides scientific data that guides professionals such as counselors, teachers, and social workers to choose methods that work. And so as an instructor, for example, you're not just going into the classroom teaching. There is evidence-based, well, your practices and how you teach class is supported by prior research, how students might receive content, what are the best ways to teach math versus English. All those stem from research in psychology. And so rather than, relying on guesswork or tradition, and I highlight tradition here because that's solutions, we like tradition, even though it's like not always supported by empirical science, it removes the guesswork from using tradition. And so what we're doing, in theory, science provides us with like objective, and I use that term loosely, and we can go into that, objective data to inform our practices. And so one example might be using empirical data to design an intervention to increase job readiness among solutions. And again, later we'll have concrete examples of some projects one might be able, or some answers or some questions one might be able to ask and address in the solution context more specifically. Another reason why it matters, it shapes public policy. Again, a lot of the decisions that we make, well, I hope at the government level, should be informed by data. And so reliable psychological research can influence legislation and national strategies. And so you think about mental health, anti-bullying campaigns. How do we get secondary school children to stop drinking soda? How do we increase engagement in sports, decrease drug and alcohol use, et cetera, et cetera? And I think oftentimes people might categorize those areas of inquiry into public health or the social sciences more generally, but all of these questions and interventions could be informed by some research in psychology. So an example here is research on school violence and how that can lead to the development of anti-bullying campaigns in the solution context specifically. And improves education, mental health, and community development. Like, yay, mental health stuff. And so that's like the general idea. But again, you'll see that we'll expand what our definitions of psychology is and what we think about it. I think the average person thinks about psychology as it's clinical or counseling, talk therapy. You only go if you're like suffering from psychosis or siufu, or people might assume that you're possessed by demons. But that's not the case. So we'll just broaden our understanding of psychology. And so an example here is a study on stress levels among single mothers in St. Lucia. And how can we develop or use some research to develop interventions to reduce, for example, postpartum depression? Again, it sounds very public healthy, but it's all, I promise, in the field of psychology. Okay, and so, I'm just hedged by saying I love my country, but, we have some things that we need to address. Okay, so why isn't research psychology more common in St. Lucia? And so this is, from my observations, I have little data to support, no data to support this claim, but yeah. But often, well, for me, a lot of this is just descriptive in that they just don't exist. And so you can't have data on things that don't exist. And so there's a lack of dedicated research institutions focused on psychology. Yesterday, I was surprised that Open Campus offered a degree in psychology here. I did not know that. Yeah. There's little funding or no funding for social science research. There are few trained research psychologists in the country. I can probably name 2 people, 3, 2 of which reside outside the island. And so there's like that thinking about like, where are the research psychologists? Scarcity of research tool, data access, and lab space. So thinking more general infrastructure. Underdeveloped research culture in schools. We don't, the only research we conduct in secondary schools at A levels are in chemistry, biology, and physics. That's where you do SBAs on agriculture. And beyond that, we don't engage in any other form of research in psychology, public health, for example. Policy decisions are often made without local behavioral data. And so you can think about some of the government campaigns. It's like, okay, we need, for example, we need community programs for job readiness without really doing the study on like, what types of jobs are people getting and what type of jobs do people want? What are the skills that people are desiring to acquire? And so oftentimes you take a top-down approach, agencies, NGOs, non-government organizations make decisions on what they think people want, and then they go do it. But in psychology, it's important to understand what people want first before we can develop interventions or programs for them. And so generally, it's an issue of the people, the infrastructures, the resources. And I argue a large part of it too, embedded in all that at all levels, is just like a limited understanding or misconceptions about what psychology as a field is, what psychologists do or can do, and how we go about doing the work that we do. And so another reason I hypothesize is while we don't really have a lot of research psychologists in the solution context, is misconceptions about psychology. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, psychology is often misunderstood as when you talk therapy. You only go to a psychologist if, again, you have some mental or psychological distress. And we'll talk more about low awareness of subfields of psychology, and so I'll just like put an asterisk there. The idea that research is only for academics or overseas experts. It's like, no, there are a lot of competent, capable people in St. Lucia who are able to engage with the scientific process. And in fact, it's better when people from the cultural context conduct research on their population. You have more insights into why people do the things that they do, why people act of the cultural nuances. Students, and again, from top down, teachers think about like the government might not see psychology as a science. You think about this when you talk about science at the CXC level or CAPE level. CAPE level, we think chemistry, biology, physics. And we ignore psychology. And then stigma surrounding mental health can discourage open discussions about psychology. And so I don't need to belabor the point, the stigma of mental illness that's like prevalent in St. Lucia, but also misconceptions about the causes of mental illness. I'm sure you've heard to some extent that someone who's experiencing psychosis like schizophrenia and hearing voices, people might say they curse them or voodoo, instead of trying to recognize some of the biological underpinnings of psychosis that might exist. Any questions? Yeah, speak fast when I get very excited, and I can go on and rants. Okay, and so again, going to the points of misconceptions about psychology, how many subfields of psychology can you name? Okay, forensic psychology, developmental, clinical. You said yeah. Yeah. Cognitive, counseling, social, industrial, organizational, military, organizational, behavior, cultural, and you can add cross-cultural, educational, school, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can think about, so again, here this represents on the left, I guess you're right, represents misconceptions about psychology. So we think talk therapy. And so represented here, it's the reason why I wanted to be a psychologist, Sigmund Freud. I love Freud. I went to like his old house/office in Vienna. It was like my pilgrimage. It's like going to Mecca. Again, I digress. Okay, and so we have the 5 pillars of psychology represented here: biological psychology, cognitive, developmental, social, personality, and mental health and physical. And I'll show that embedded in all these like broad areas of psychology as sub-disciplines. And so illustrating the divisions of the American Psychological Association. And so you can think of each of the divisions as focus areas in the field of psychology. And officially, the American Psychological Association has 54 divisions. And so that's 54 groups of people that use different theories to sometimes ask and answer the same question. And you see some here. So general psychology just like spreads just across all areas of psychology. We have experimental cognitive psychology or cognitive psychology, people who focus on qualitative methods to ask and answer a lot of questions, and we'll go to that at the end. Comparative psychology, comparing like humans to non-human primates, or using animal models to inform human models. Developmental psychology, social psychology, where I fall, but it's also health psychology. I'm at the intersection of social and health psychology, clinical, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the gist of like psychology. There's psychology focused on just like studying issues of men and masculinities. There's psychology of gender. And I think that, based on all the areas of psychology and all the, the social ills that St. Lucia faces, we can ask a lot of questions. But, those subfields are not independent, so there's a lot of intradisciplinarity here. And so here, just like one kind of visual representation of how psychology functions. And so biological psychology can ask the question, how does activity in your brain and body give rise to your thoughts, feelings, and actions? And so if we want to understand behavior, for example, when you're afraid, why do you run away? You know, what are fear responses? You can think about people who target the amygdala, cognitive. How do your mental activities affect your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? And so if you're ruminating, you're thinking about, you know, things that happened to you in the past, how does that influence your behavior currently or your feelings currently? Developmental, how to change over your life. And so think of like life force perspective, influence your thoughts, feelings, and actions. So you can think, for example, about cultural shifts that kind of shape individuals across cohorts. So like why you might be different from your parents and why your children might be different from you. So what are some of the cohort effects here? Social and personality psychology. So that's what I have my PhD in specifically. How do social factors and personal characteristics influence your thoughts, feelings, and actions? And so a lot of social psychology focuses on group processes. And so how does your involvement in a group influence your behavior? So think gang violence as a group, an example. And mental and physical health. So what effects are your mental and physical health, and how do you develop healthy behaviors? And so my research specifically is at the intersection of, like I said, social and personality psychology with health and psychology. So understanding how group processes, norms, beliefs, and value systems influences individual behavior or health behavior specifically. And so across a lot of the work that I do, they're not really centered in social psychology specifically or health psychology. They span a lot of things that I'm just interested in and questions that I'm interested in. And then a lot of this, like I said, happens in the US context. And so thinking about how homophobia is related to suicide ideation among sexual minority individuals, thinking about how beliefs that an individual is resilient influences the extent to which they seek healthcare across mental, physical, dental, and vision. And so if you think you're resilient, you go to the doctor. And so that's that one paper. Thinking about how ideas of being a tough man is associated with poor mental health. And so oftentimes men are expected to not show emotion, to not seek support, to not seek help. How is that associated oftentimes negatively with their mental health? Thinking about how structural barriers to not having access to transportation, not having access to insurance might lead people to hold negative attitudes about seeking healthcare. And so if you don't have the money, you don't have the time, you can't get the time off, do you go to the doctor? The answer is probably no. Thinking about how the context, so neighborhoods specifically and ideas we have about neighborhoods influences judgments we make about people. So that's like another paper here. And here is qualitative investigation, really examining how people with mental illness find support within community. And so again, as a social personality psychologist, this is some of the questions that I've answered, published across multiple journals. And so I like to think of myself as just like a general psychologist, but I don't really know. Still trying to figure that out. Okay, and so this is just like I said, just presented a broad overview of like what psychology entails, and this is just like a slice of what that entails. I think there is like, even within social psychology, for example, you can go to the social psychology conference, and at the social psychology conference, there are pre-conferences, and so you'll have like people, culture, health, that's a pre-conference. Culture is a pre-conference. Health is a pre-conference. Law and decision-making is a pre-conference. Self and identity is a pre-conference. Group processes and intergroup relations. And so within subfields, there are other niche areas. And so here, I'm just gonna focus on like 5 main areas of psychology and just have us imagine what are some of the questions we can ask within each of the fields, okay? And I'll start with my bias, obviously, to study social psychology. Yeah. No applause a second. Okay, so social psychology studies how individuals' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. And actually, yeah, the actual, imagined, or implied presence is, I think, important. So you have people in the room, so that's actual, imagined, and I might, people might throw stones at me. And so oftentimes in social psychology, imagined really oftentimes includes things like deities. Like people's behaviors change when they think that God is watching them, right? The extent to which the person, God is actually there or not, that's not my place to make that judgment. But again, just giving an overview of the field. Or implied, you might think that the government is listening to you through your phone, and that might influence what you say. I love the US. Okay, and so The field, this field examines topics like group behavior, social perception, prejudice, aggression, and social influence. And so this is like one question we might be able to answer or ask or investigate in the St. Lucian context using a social psychological lens. And so crime rates and public safety are major concerns in St. Lucia, especially with rising youth crime. Social psychology can help explore the underlying causes of criminal behavior, including how societal expectations, peer influences, and environmental stressors might lead individuals to criminality. And as we know, crime is not randomly distributed in St. Lucia. Oftentimes it's concentrated within neighborhoods, within districts in St. Lucia. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? Why are individuals who are in neighborhoods with high crime rates and gangs more likely to join gangs? Why are people from impoverished neighborhoods more likely to engage in criminal activity? And so some of the questions we might be able to ask using a social psychological lens is like, how do social factors, again, peer pressure, influence criminal behavior in St. Lucia? How does the media shape public perception of crime and safety in St. Lucia? And so what are the neighborhoods you avoid? What are the neighborhoods that you go to? What are the neighborhoods you have stereotyped? Or people from the neighborhoods, for example, you can think, Marsha, do you stereotype or have ideas of someone because of the neighborhood that they're from? Do you think they're more likely to engage in criminal behavior? How does that shape your interaction with them? And in turn, how does that shape their own interactions with others? Can we use community-based interventions to reduce crime involvement? And so in gathering the data, understanding people's situation, how can we develop interventions? So if crime stems from a lack of job opportunities, then the intervention should focus on creating more jobs. If crime seems to be a function of limited educational opportunities, then we should increase educational opportunities. If crime is a function of being in a neighborhood that has a lot of gang activity, then we should work or find ways to either protect individuals or inoculate them from being able to join gangs, or get rid of the gangs in its entirety. And so this, I tried my best to find psychology research on St. Lucia. It doesn't exist, and so I'll just say that. Yeah, so it doesn't exist. And so a lot of the examples are just what I can find that kind of is closely approximates some of the questions that we may be able to answer in a St. Lucian context. And so, for example, in this study here, they're looking at psychological factors, and the abstract is here. Psychological factors predicting gang-related crime. And I'll talk about, we don't need to go into statistical significance and all that. But what they did find was that individuals who are in neighborhoods with more gangs are more likely to engage in gang activities. And it's like, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Individuals who engage in antisocial behavior are more likely to steal, are more likely to break the law, are also more likely to be gang affiliated. And so thinking about, okay, who are the individuals and what can we do to reduce the extent to which they might engage in criminal activity? And so that's one thing that we can do. Any thoughts? Okay, and so that's, addressing a question related to like crime and violence using a social psychological lens. But again, you can ask a lot of other different questions drawing from different sub areas of psychology. And so I'll turn to developmental psychology. And so developmental psychology focuses on how people grow and how they change throughout their lifespan. So thinking from infancy to old age. It explores cognitive, emotional, and social development at different stages of life. Okay. And so in talking to Avian yesterday, I was like, oh my God, what is an interesting developmental psychological question, people might be interested in, and for lack of a better term, and I've always been so curious about them, what people call like barrel babies. So people who oftentimes their parents migrate to a foreign country and they're raised by family members having limited interaction with their parents, well, direct limited interaction with their parents. And so many parents from St. Lucia migrate to the US for better opportunities. The children left behind may experience attachment difficulties. So how do they form relationships with adults? How do they form relationships with romantic partners? Those individuals might feel abandoned, might, hold the fear of abandonment throughout their lifetime, might not trust individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And so this can have long-term impacts on their emotional well-being and even academic success. So think about, a 7-year-old in school who both parents migrated and left them for their aunt. and they engage with their parent for like 10 years only via WhatsApp, or even now recently. You think of the people who did not have, WhatsApp in the 90s and the 80s, who only spoke to their parents over the phone like once every 6 months. Okay, and so these issues are particularly relevant for understanding developmental challenges children may face. And so those are some of the questions, again, we might be able to ask, again, using a developmental psychological lens. How does parental migration to the US affect attachment styles in children? Do children with absent parents, so signs of attachment issues? And what impact does disrupted attachment have on academic, emotional, and social development of children? And so, whereas we can focus on the immediate solution context, we can also, again, focus on migration in a very different way using developmental psychological lens. And so here in this study, again, not focused on St. Lucia, looking at the mental health consequences of having an absentee parent. And so not necessarily the parent has migrated, but, children who were raised in a household where one parent was absent, and not necessarily absent as in not being in the house physically only, but with limited meaningful contact with the parent. And you can see here, again, not going into the results, they looked at, the relationship with stress, anxiety, depression, self-esteem, satisfaction, and communication. And again, not going into ideas of statistical significance, but you can see some of the factors, for example, family conflict that are associated with like poor mental health and like lower self-esteem among those individuals. Okay, again, even in adulthood. And so thinking about, we may not see it and people may not talk about it, but some of those individuals might have, severe chronic lifelong feelings of abandonment. Okay. Educational psychology, I'm very passionate about the educational part. I have a lot of thoughts about, what's it now, CPA? See? A CPEA that's happening today and tomorrow. We have 11 10-year-olds making what I perceive to be lifelong decisions. Education opportunities are not distributed equally in St. Lucia. I went to Roseau Combined School, which was a very, very different experience than a lot of my peers had when I went to college. And I still have a lot of thoughts about that. But, I'm all these years later, but you stop there. Okay, so educational psychology focuses on how people learn in educational settings and the factors that impact learning. And so it examines issues like motivation, classroom behavior, learning disabilities, and academic achievement. And we know solutions love the educated. And now just leave that there. Yeah, the academic, yeah. And so I think about and we probably all heard, students in our own classrooms called deck. Teachers calling students deck. And I was like, wait, what? Looking back, I was like, oh my God, we have a lot of issues. Or how teachers sometimes will show favoritism to the smart child or children in the classroom, how they're lauded and praised, over others, and so there's preferential treatments. And so students with learning disabilities they do face discrimination or stigma, and that can affect your self-esteem, right? You're in a classroom, in front of your peers, your teacher is calling you deck. And you're like, well, how does that make you feel, especially as a child, and especially as a young adult coming into your own identity. But also, what are the pressures that we put on the bright students, right? The expectation that the student now writing CPEA is supposed to go to college, and now they're in the exam room and they're stressed because they're worried that they're going to let their teachers down and their family down. What does that stress? What does that do, and how does that impact 10, 11-year-olds? And so students with learning disabilities, so some of the questions we might be able to ask or investigate: how does discrimination against students with learning disabilities affect their motivation? So if you come into class and your teachers is calling you deck and treating you, less preferentially than how they're treating the smart students, you want to come to class? Do you feel the need to do the work? That might lead to feelings of hopelessness. Why try? I'm a deck, I'm not gonna learn. What's the point of studying for common entrance? Or for studying for CXC, I'm not gonna do well anyway. So what are the barriers to inclusive education? And so you can think about, do teachers in a solution context get appropriate training to deal with students with learning disabilities? But also, how do we push them, change the cultural norms of how we engage with students who do not perform, to expectations? And how can teachers and educational institutions in St. Lucia improve support for students? And so there's a learning and an intervention, right? How do we educate people, but also how do we change their behavior? And so this study, I know it's a lot here, looking at differences in, psychological outcomes for students with learning disabilities versus students who do not perform well versus students who perform well. And just generally what we're seeing here is that students with learning disabilities tend to report greater helplessness, lower self-esteem, for example, greater depression. And so thinking about those experiences in the classroom, but also not being able to identify. I know there's a lot of talk in Lucia about the extent to which ADHD is a meaningful diagnosis, or, does the child have ADHD or are they lazy? Il fait un, il pas travail. Things, yeah, and be very dismissive. And again, we might miss a lot of people who need real support. Yeah, I can speak Creole, so I don't know exactly. Okay. And then health psychology examines biological, social, and psychological factors that influence health behaviors and outcomes. And so the field looks at lifestyle choices, stress, coping mechanism, and mental, physical health impacts on overall well-being. And every time I come to St. Lucia, I think about the rates of diabetes, and I sometimes think like, I wonder if, when we had the health campaigns, like psychoeducational health campaigns, we focused too much on soft drinks and sweets and ignored the hard food, the dasheen, the yam, the fig. Because if we want to talk to people, they're always like, well, I don't drink, my boy soft drink. They're not, and I'm like, well, you're also eating mac and cheese with a side of rice, with a side of potato salad, and you have green banana, you have plantains, you have dasheen, you have yam, you have chicken stewed with sugar, and 2 leaves of cabbage. And then we wonder, and so how do we educate people to like change it? How do we have them better proportion their meals? I can't imagine a Sunday meal in St. Lucia being like 30%, like 5, I just can't, but there's things we should think about. And I say that as I come here and I eat roti every day and bouillon, so it is what it is. Okay, and so going back to the example earlier about like prostate cancer, so prostate cancer is a significant health issue in St. Lucia. Men are reluctant to go screening, as is with masculinity, homophobia, the screening process. And so health psychology can help design interventions that can increase awareness and reduce barriers to screening and to increase early detection, right? And so what are the cultural attitudes towards prostate cancer screening among St. Lucian men? How does knowledge and awareness of prostate cancer influence willingness to participate? And like, what are the psychological factors? So we have like fear, misinformation, deter St. Lucian men from prostate cancer treatment or screening. And again, this is all work that we can do in psychology. And again, going back to this idea of interdisciplinarity. And so they draw from all the sub areas, but the central line focus here is trying to understand health behavior. And the health behavior here is screening. And so I found work in the Caribbean, more generally, and not St. Lucia specifically. And so here, looking at the social determinants of prostate cancer in the Caribbean, and what they found, and you can imagine why, men with less formal education have higher rates of cancer, which makes sense. And so if you think the Caribbean context, if you're more educated, you probably have a better job. And if you have a better job, you probably have better access to healthcare. And if you have better access to healthcare, you can probably, or you would be screened or go to the doctor sooner. Yeah, sorry. Be screened, early detection of cancer. And so here we see the relationship between education and cancer diagnosis, but it could be explained by other factors, right? What does education, what barriers does having less education, formal education in the Caribbean context present, and how is that then associated with cancer diagnosis? Okay. And then finally, because I can't talk about psychology without talking about clinical psychology, it's like I want something else. And so clinical psychology, what oftentimes we understand psychology to be, involves diagnosing and treating mental health issues. So mood disorders, anxiety, and personality disorders. And I think specifically in a St. Lucian context, a lot of that has to do with education about what mental illness is or what psychosis is, especially among young adults. I tend to remember, I probably would never do that, but you can think of like when you were young and you told your mother you're stressed, ou pas travail, ou pas ish, you have nothing, ou pas kai. Why are you stressed? You know what I mean? Why are you stressed? And so this is the idea of like, stress is only for adults or people who have quote unquote issues, or you're depressed. What are you depressed for? You know, if you're depressed, go get a book. That's what I say. Go get a book, read, do work, you're depressed because you're on your phone all the time. And so this like cultural like narratives about like what the causes of mental illness is also influences how we think about it, right? Okay, and so we can think about how we can use clinical psychology to really understand suicide rates among men in St. Lucia specifically, but this in St. Lucia more generally. And so research here could explore links of cultural norms, emotional suppression, and mental health struggles. And we can think about potentially developing interventions. And so again, going with ideas of like masculinity, a lot of men oftentimes don't feel that they could express their emotions or be vulnerable with themselves, with their friends, or with meaningful others. And so to understand suicide risk among men in St. Lucia, we can ask ourselves again, what are the primary psychological, social, and cultural factors that are associated with high suicide rates among St. Lucian men? What are some of the societal expectations of masculinity? So how a man should act? Does that lead to greater psychological distress and therefore suicide? And what mental health services, what mental health services and interventions are available? And I will say that there is a lot of effort, in the Owen King Hospital. There's a lot of effort, but we need more. We can applaud the work that has been done, but also recognize that more work should be done. Did I? Yeah, I'm trying to advance the slide. Maybe yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay. And so here I found, a study close to home looking at the correlates of suicide ideation among adolescents in Trinidad. And so here they compare, looking at the correlates among men specifically, looking at the correlates among women specifically, and the total. And so you see here, there's a relationship between, drug and alcohol use, like marijuana, drinking, with suicide ideation. There seems to be an association with being bullied. There's association with like psychological distress, we think anxiety. There's also seems to be an association with parental understanding. And so if your parents don't understand you, that seems to be associated with suicide ideation or not having close friends. And so we can think about the individual, but also social, familial, and contextual factors that are associated with suicide ideation in a context. Okay, any reflections, thoughts on what I just shared? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and so you can, and so it just depends on your focus. And so because I'm like a social health psychologist, I focus a lot on health. But you can use psychology to understand, like one of my grad students is interested in understanding helping behavior. And so how do we increase people's support for social programs? And so there's like volitional, and I should know this. Volitional, non-volitional helping. And so do people believe that if you help someone, they're going to get dependency? They're going to get dependent on structures and therefore just not work? Or do people think that helping, if the government helps someone, do they feel motivated and therefore will act and no longer need help? So you can study helping behavior. Some people study that's like something different, Eden, that's something different. One of my colleagues studies relationships. And so dyadic romantic relationships, how do people feel secure in their relationships with their partner, broadening out to how people feel secure in their relationships with their parents, thinking of attachment styles. Some other people in my department studies like autism using rat models. And so if we turn on and off gene expressions, even mice, can that inform our understanding of like mental illness in humans? And so there is this broad, but because I'm like interested in like health, I focus a lot on this like the health behavioral component. But yeah, it's like a very broad field. Sometimes too broad, I think. Yeah. Or if you're interested in like organizational structure, like how do you get people, in your workplace motivated to work so that you can make more money off them? There's a field, IO psychology, that focuses exactly on that. And so not help. Okay. And so, I wanted to make a point that there's a lot of statistics in psychology. Yeah, like if you're a quantitative, if you're a quantitative researcher, there's just like a lot, and I glanced over a lot of that. And then I think often people are surprised. And so we'll have the presentation on Friday applying to PhD programs in the US, focusing on public health and psychology more specifically. And that's one of the things I'm going to emphasize. In most traditional PhD programs in the US in psychology, you'll have to do stats. Even though you might want to do qualitative research, you will have to take a stats course. And so that's one of the things. Like even qualitative researchers have to take stats courses, and the discourse around that is important. Or you can be a qualitative researcher or focus, having focus groups, interviews, N-of-1 studies to really get at the nuanced understandings of people's lived experiences. And so that's some of the approaches you can take. And you'll also see, based on like the examples that I presented, that the field is not as siloed as the divisions in AP make them seem to be. But you can be you can be interested in health behavior, but draw a lot from cultural psychology and social psychology. We're interested in this clinical psychology or educational psychology, learning disabilities, but draw from social psychology. How do children with learning disabilities experience the classroom? Are they discriminated against? And so that's bringing educational and social psychology together. And to your earlier question, the field of psychology itself just draws from just like a lot of other areas, because human beings, right? We're human beings, we're studying human behavior, human cognitions, human affect. And so we kind of have to draw from a lot of other areas to inform our research question. When I was in grad school, there was someone who studied synchronicity. And so how do people in orchestras synchronize over time? And so what you find happening, oftentimes people in orchestras, I guess because you're playing same music, their heartbeats and their breathing will synchronize. Yeah, and it's like, oh, that's like an interesting thing to study. I would never study that. Yeah, one of my grad students did his master's degree in like psycholinguistics. And so how do people like process language? And it's like, oh my God, that's like a really interesting, yeah. As well, like the mental imagery that comes to mind, and why I have a friend who is French, and apparently English has a lot of words to communicate the same thing. And so we talked about like in French, there's one word, voyage, but yeah, but in English, we have journey, trip, voyage, and all three of those things, travel, and all four of those mean something different depending on the context. And so I think it's like really interesting. Or I can think about like business psychology, organizational psychology, like the example that I presented earlier. A biological psychology, I was just reviewing a paper, they're looking at the relationship between menstrual cycle in women and sexual desire. And so you're going at the hormonal level, so thinking of like estrogen, and one of the reviews, like, you also think about testosterone because the rates increase. And it's like, yeah, so thinking about estrogen, testosterone levels among women and how that influences like sexual desire. And so that's things you don't think about that all happen within the domain of psychology. Yeah. And you can also think, some of the questions are both basic and applied. And I think a lot of the questions I presented seem to be more on the applied side. And so there's scientific discovery, but a lot of, I think, what I'm interested in moving forward is like, how do we apply the knowledge that we've gained from these studies to develop interventions and remedy social ills in St. Lucia, right? And so, for example, we might identify that children with learning disabilities are discriminated in the classroom. We might identify that they experience psychological distress, they have lower self-esteem, lower motivation. And so that's the basic research part. But what do we do about that? Okay, do we educate teachers, to better have them treat or how in the engagement of students with learning disabilities? Do we, tell teachers like, actually, you don't call children deck-decks, and you should be cautious in how you laud the bright students in the classroom, and also developing those specific interventions. Okay, and so I was hoping to just educate people to think more broadly about psychology, moving beyond Freudian, therapy, talk therapy views of the field. And so we should not estimate the role of psychology in a country's future. I think it will ultimately help with its development. Research psychology offers a tool to address complex challenges. I presented some examples, violence, suicide rates, educational disparities. Let's shape evidence-based solutions and promote overall societal health. And so together we can lay the foundation for a brighter future. And that's what I hope, Avian's and I's presentation on Friday is going to hopefully capture, like, oh, if you're interested in getting like a PhD in North America or in Europe, France specifically, come to the talk on Friday, because I think there are a lot of people who might be interested in pursuing just like research degrees. Okay, thank you. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, time for questions.
So I think in one part of the presentation, we were talking about psychology versus tradition or like culture in St. Lucia or like other parts of the world, for example. So I wanted to ask, what would be your approach? Like, how will you approach the view that psychology is challenging traditions or like cultures that have existed or that people believe to have worked in the past? So especially, I would say, for example, in the case of like immigrant children, where parents are like, oh, this has worked for us in the past, so I don't see why, they might not believe that looking at at a problem like stress through a psychological lens, might be helpful to a child, because they're saying, well, when we grew up, we were not used to this. We were told, oh, go get your book, go study. You're just pretending, or, so what, what would your approach, be to that view that psychology might be challenging, like, known traditions that people believe to have worked or that have worked for some people in the past?
Yeah, and so often traditions are functional, and so we engaged in previous behavior because it was like functional to the life that we were living. And what I try to tell people is that culture changes. Do you have to spend 10 hours a day in a book? We know based on evidence that does not work. It does not improve academic performance. Studying 10 hours a day doesn't do that. And so trying to educate people about the need to engage with evidence-based practices. And it's often hard because people sometimes will attribute the success to the traditions, even though the traditions have nothing to do with their success. That's based on like evidence. And so I think about stress. I look back at like my own experience growing up. It's like a lot of people are stressed. They may not label it as stress. They may just think that God is challenging them or trying them, but it doesn't change the fact that it's stress. It doesn't change the fact that cortisol levels are high, people are diabetic, even though they've believed that the hard food is healthier. And so a lot of it is just like education, and people are resistant to education. And so that's why I always think like, let's start younger. Not to say that we shouldn't try to shape the minds of our older, ancestors. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's always the tension between culturally held values and beliefs with this like evidence-based science. And some people are oftentimes convinced, others are not. I think about like my mom trying to convince her friends that the COVID vaccine was like legitimate. And so you have like one person that I know in her cohort is like, the science works. And then other people are like, oh no, they're trying to control us. Yeah, and so there's always that tension, yes. And so I know some people who do work on misinformation, for example, and a lot of the work on misinformation is like, why do people discount scientific evidence and hold on to like cultural beliefs and value systems? Or why are some people more receptive to like the scientific evidence and discount cultural practices? So I don't really answer to that question, only to acknowledge that it's a tension. Yeah.
This may be a comment more than a question, or maybe both. What I find is that in terms of psychology in particular, what may be foreign is how it's disseminated. So I remember when I was in grad school, I had a professor, actually a statistics professor, who would say to us after we found a p-value, say it in English. So what does that mean to the everyday person? that result that you found, that P is less than 0.05, or right, what does that mean? And so when you're trying to disseminate to the everyday person, I remember during COVID-19 in particular, when we had this global pandemic, I was so impressed actually in St. Lucia that we had information being disseminated in two languages, Creole and English. And I thought that was novel, at least from my experience, that they were trying so hard to communicate, really ensuring that the everyday person who speaks Creole understood okay, I need you to stand 3 feet apart for this reason. And they brought it down to that level that it was, palatable and in chunks. So people got, okay, I need to stand 3 feet because I may get sick. Right. So I wonder if the disconnect or the bridge that we have to make is, how do we make it
Transitional.
relatable in a St. Lucian Caribbean context, so that people say, okay, well, this relates to me. This is schizophrenia over here. This is depression. What is depression? I resonate with what you said about when, I remember when I don't know what it was when I was younger, worried about something, and my dad would say, well, just eat a mango, something like that, which was, I was like, okay, but, and I don't think he meant any harm, but it was in his context, you're okay, you should be,
Yes.
it's going to be okay. And and things got better or whatever, you move on with life and so forth. And we're taught so much in our Caribbean context to make things are going to get better, and so forth. So, but how do we make it, my question is, I guess the statement is, how do we make it relatable? Like, this is something that you can access, educational psychology even, like these are not these things over here that are just for the academics, or people who read research papers, right? Because most of us will not, I guess the everyday man is not going to go into the Journal of Psychology and open that up. But how do we bring it to, so maybe that's, a start. It's something I've been thinking about for years with, especially science and how we disseminate. But I remember in public health for COVID-19, I was thoroughly impressed with how they were able to say, okay, this is how you stay well. And when they talked about, even the types of vaccines and the types of tests, the rapid test versus the other one, and there's so much information circling around. I understand why people were confused. We had all these scientists or non-scientists online speaking with authority about, information that they didn't really have evidence. It wasn't evidence-based, basically. So maybe that's something we can start thinking about more, how do we, like presentations like this, how do we bring it to the everyday person, so it's more, it makes more sense.
Yeah, and I think there are two large issues. And so one is, where does the science come from? And then the second point is like, how do we translate the science? And so the first point is, where does the science come from? The science does not come from St. Lucia. And so what we have happening is that our policymakers, non-government organizations, sometimes people like me, will come in, and present research conducted in American context with American undergraduate students or American adults, and just like superimpose it on St. Lucia. And so, oh yeah, Americans, think about depression in this way. Do St. Lucians also think about depression in the American way? And it's like, you have to start somewhere, but we also have to understand specifically, how do St. Lucians understand depression? Like in a St. Lucian cultural context, what does depression look like? And so we have to do research in St. Lucia. But it's also, like you pointed out, an issue of translation and psychoeducation. And so over the years, I started my career thinking that we should ignore all the cultural components because they're not valid. And so, yes, this person thinks that, their son with schizophrenia, someone bewitched them and they have to go to a witch doctor. And then we should just like pound them in their head that, oh no, this is like biophysiological. And then you should go to a psychiatrist. And so that's one approach. Or the second approach is to hold both things to be true. Like recognize that like this view of mental illness is culturally specific, but also try to encourage people to consider this also this additional truth that yes, this person might have been bewitched, but you also need to seek professional care to like manage the illness. And so we don't do that in St. Lucia because I think we don't even do the primary research. And so your question about like, how do we translate or apply the research in a St. Lucian context? And I have to say that, well, first I have to do it. Yeah, and so things like that, things like this talk on Friday is one approach. It's like, hey, this is a field that exists. These are the possibilities within the field. Those are some of the questions that we can ask in the field, in the St. Lucian context. Let's begin to ask and investigate these questions. Let's broaden out, and then hopefully we can translate. And so, hey, St. Lucian people, we don't know what depression is. This is how the average St. Lucian thinks about depression. This is how the average St. Lucian thinks about the cause of depression. And we recognize that, but what does science say? And how can we disseminate both truths? Yeah.
So my question was actually related to Linda's. I think she was focused on as individuals, but my question was actually about bridging the gap between research and action through national policy. So particularly in the area of health, if the research is saying something, how do we then now make something a national policy? Well, or even if it's education, if there's research showing this is how students should be treated based on their developmental level, how do we now get that into policy areas and not, yes, for the individual, some things are important, but that connection, what do we need to, and I know this is a start, but
yeah,
it has to be.
Yes. The structures, shout me out, government, my email. Yeah, and I think we need to get this, like the stakeholders involved, right? And so can we get the Ministry of Education in the room to engage with some of like the evidence-based practices? What does Teachers College look like? What are the teachers in training taught? What are some of the teachings that are just tradition, things that we have done always in St. Lucia, versus what are elements of like the teaching training that are evidence-based? And so that's like the one piece. What are some pieces of the evidence-based practices that do translate well in St. Lucia? And what are those that we need to kind of inject or incorporate, consider some St. Lucia cultural specific nuances, like how children interact with teachers in St. Lucia are very different from how children interact with teachers in the US. And so a similar model might not work. And so I think that's where we have to start. The people who are invested, the stakeholders, should come to these rooms and these meetings. But I think we need to always reevaluate our practices. And that's something I try to do. I do that in therapy a lot. Like the extent to which my actions are just informed by my upbringing in St. Lucia. And so things that I've always normalized, then it's like, oh no, that's just how people are. And I'm realizing, oh no, that's how St. Lucians are. Oh, that's just how I am. And so trying to like, reevaluate a lot of the things that we do. And sometimes it is worth letting go of tradition. Ooh, I only got attacked. But sometimes I think it is, when I think about like my experience in the classroom in St. Lucia, and I was like, oh my God, some of this was horrible. And I can see why some people just like don't come to class. I can see why some people just didn't have the motivation to do work when you've been like scolded by teachers, you've been beaten. My views on corporal punishment have like changed over the years, thinking about like motivation. But I don't know. I honestly don't know how to get these people in the room, or the extent to which people are willing to reconsider practices that they've thought works. Yeah, and it's like, does the practice work necessarily? Oh, if it does work, can we improve on it? And there's always room for improvement, right? And so yes, it works, but how can we make it better? Especially in the 21st century, like the change in like cultural landscape. St. Lucia is not the same. I know people have been taught the same way that my mom was taught like 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And that doesn't seem appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. But I am hearing at least get the stakeholders in the same room.
Yes.
I have another question, and I'll give up the mic. So I've been looking at how communication happens in the health sector. And there's an issue to me, and it has to do with behavior, that sometimes to effect behavior change, we go to the extreme. I have two cases in point that I study in communication, that when the issue of HIV/AIDS came about, the poster that I remember very clearly in my mind is a tombstone. Yeah? Because AIDS equaled death. And that is how they got people to respond, to think about it. And then they had to go and correct it, that it's okay now to sit next to somebody with HIV and touch them and even hug them. And even for COVID, we did that. We created that space. And then, so for me as a communication specialist, why do we have to go to that extent? Because sometimes it's necessary because you want that immediate change, but then there's so much work to correct it. And since you're looking at health and you're looking at, have you studied how to communicate in the health sector when there is an emergency? If nobody has, I think you'll need to, because this is the second one in my lifetime that I'm witnessing.
Yeah.
And the correction is hard.
Yeah, so I don't study health behavior, but my mentor studies health behavior change. And one of his grad students studies specifically like health misinformation, and in the COVID context specifically, giving people anyway. And so the general take home that I remember is that oftentimes we try to focus a lot of our health communication, the extremes of the distribution. And so the people who do not believe the information at all, we try to like convince them, bring them to the other side, and that requires extreme information. And so what I've learned from him is that we should target the people who are ambivalent. So the people in the middle who are not sure what the right answer is, and then you can have softer messages, because the people in the middle oftentimes represent a majority of the distribution. And so those people might be more reasonable if you present it as, oh, you can sit next to someone with HIV, you can hug them. These people might be more receptive to that information than the HIV equals death. And so what I think happens, and again, just recalling my conversations with him, is that we think that the extreme message will capture everyone, but the extreme message oftentimes only captures the extreme people. Yeah. And so we need to focus on the distribution. And that just means that some people are going to be left out. In an ideal world, you will have multiple targeted messages. That's like what happened in an ideal world. You have the people who have like limited knowledge about HIV, people have average knowledge about HIV, and people who are very knowledgeable about HIV. In an ideal world, you'll communicate something different to all these people. So people who have a high, objective knowledge about HIV. I actually have a project on knowledge about HIV and attitudes to HIV testing. So people who have like knowledgeable about HIV, you don't need to tell them HIV equals death. They know that's not true. So the message you wouldn't give. The people with average, adequate knowledge about HIV, you give them more. It's like, oh, you thought that you could get HIV by hugging someone. You can't, because they might think that like touching is okay, but hugging is not. And so you have those like targeted. And so people with like little knowledge, that's where a lot of the work comes. And rather than educating them, we scare them. Yes, fear. We use fear as like a motivator when it's not always fear, it's just knowledge. So yeah. And so ideal world, we have targeted messages, but in the real world, we should target the people in the middle because they oftentimes represent a bulk of the distribution.
Okay, two questions. One, they're kind of related, but one for you on a personal level and then as a professional. So again, we talk about the whole thing of connecting research and action. Based on the research you have done so far, has there been a clear example where you have adapted your own behavior based on your research? And then on a professional level, do you find yourself, where does the research end for you? So is it simply when you have completed the study, or do you see yourself also in an activist role where, okay, I have done the research and now I want to see this action represented based on my research? Because we talk about this, the struggle of always like, can we get the stakeholders involved and stuff like that? And most times, especially in small island contexts, we know that you have to be a generalist. So you can't just be the researcher. You must also be the communicator. You must also be the marketer, the PR person and stuff like that. So how much has that reflected in your own experience?
Yeah, I was going to say that's, and you know, I leave that for my colleagues. So, but I'll just the first one. I tell people do as I say. As I do. No, but I don't drink. Don't smoke. I guess that's like one. I stopped drinking like last year, and I just don't drink anymore. I go to therapy. I think it's like important, you know. I started therapy at a time in my life where things were going great, actually. I was like, you know, things are going great. Should probably go to therapy. That's actually, yeah. Oftentimes when I think therapy, I think oftentimes we triage. Like life is going horribly. I need to like fix something. And I'm just like, oh yeah, in the same way that sometimes we only go to the doctor when we're sick. But there are a lot of people who go to the doctor for your average annual checkup. Nothing's wrong, but you know, you go or you bring your vehicle for maintenance. Nothing doesn't have to be wrong. You can just like bring it in. And so that's like been my approach to like health and mental health. It's like, you know, regular servicing, see if anything's wrong. If I have prostate cancer, maybe it'll be detected early. Didn't have to wait until. And so that's one that changed my personal life. Professionally, yes, one has to wear many hats. And so there's this, I had the basic versus apply in the academy in the US, at least, this tension between doing community-based participatory research. And so doing work with communities and effecting change immediately versus doing work to advance like scientific knowledge that oftentimes is divorced from reality. Yeah, and so it depends on what approach. I'm more on the I do basic research that has implications for people. But I try my best to at least be aware of it. My grad student is currently going through a crisis where he wants to drop out of grad school because he has that tension of like, oh, I thought the work that I was doing was going to have some immediate impact on the communities that I'm interested in working with. And I was like, it can, but that does, you know, that requires a lot more effort and time. And so I have been trying to walk the walk. I'm here today. I'll be here on Friday. And Avian is like marketer, PRO, organizational strategist, researcher, community-based partner, and all that. And so some people are able to do that, and others, like me, I'm in the middle. Yeah, and some of my colleagues, you talk to, you know, you mention like talk to the community, and they're like, yeah, no, they'll never do it. They'll never consider it. They don't think it's important, and I'm just like, that's okay too, right? And so the basic people, basic researchers, you have the applied researchers, and you have the people in the middle who are hoping to do the translation. And so you can think of translation from the academy to the general population, but there are also translations that happen within the academy, the people who translate the basic science to the applied science pre-application, pre-intervention. And then you have the people who design and implement the interventions. And I'm more on the like, let's translate, you know, those basic research principles to something meaningful that someone can help design an intervention to help. But that's where I'm at. Yeah, I'm a very like introverted person, I think. And so boots on the ground, I'm just, yeah, I'm not that person. No, I can put on the show. I think I can talk, but like.
So
Yeah.
given that, have
Mhm.
you noticed any trends in academia where they are trying to make those collaborations like that vertical integration of, okay, here's the high-minded intellectual, here's the middleman, here's the community activist and stuff, and people actively saying, okay, how can we link so that we can actually see this research play out like we want to, or is it very siloed?
Both and. Yeah. And so what we've done over the years, so community-based participatory research, actually me and my colleague just had our paper rejected. We're going to rewrite it. Where we wrote a paper arguing for the mainstream, or we should consider using community-based participatory research more so in health psychology. And so what we did a review of from like 2004 to 2024 of all papers published in like 6 health psychology journals and examine the extent to which, you know, this papers incorporated community-based participatory research principles. It doesn't look good, it's bad. And so that was like one attempt of like, hey, my colleagues, this is something we should do and consider. So within field translation, but I digress. And so what you described is very, I think, vertical distribution where we have the ivory tower and then we have like the community-based partners somewhere in the bottom and they don't contribute equally. And so we've been trying to go away from this like hierarchical, vertical organization and more lateral, horizontal. And so, you know, people might use like community action research or community collaborative research, where the people in the ivory tower, the academics and the community partners are equal. And so you need people from the community to inform your research question. You need those people to guide how you ask the questions. You need those people to help you interpret the data. You need those people to help you translate the information. And so there is like the step again. So from vertical to more horizontal and collaborative and to being valued. So in my department, for example, for tenure and promotion, when a lot of departments don't, engaging or doing community-based participatory research is valued. And so in the Academy for tenure, peer-reviewed publications and grants what gets you tenure. But in my department, working in the community, even though there's nothing comes out of it in terms of publications and grants, is still valued. And so there is like this incremental kind of shifts that happen, but also in doing research being intentional. And so two of my undergraduate students are from Ghana, and they were interested in a project on well-being in Ghana. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess we do know things theoretically, but I had to reach out. I reached out to someone in Ghana, at the University of Ghana, as a cultural broker. It's like, hey, we need people invested in the community to kind of contextualize the work that we're doing, and to also ask like, hey, what is this next week? Is this like a meaningful enterprise, and how can we work together to just like answer a question that like my students who are Ghanaian American are interested in the Ghanaian context specifically. Yeah, I know Evian is doing a lot of that work in St. Lucia. Yeah, he is doing the work. Good.
So I just want to put a plug for the Casidic study out there, because I think as you said, Avian is doing this already. Part of the team is here, the research team, Trisha, myself, and I think, and sorry, our two colleagues from McGill as well. What we're doing, which I think directly applies to psychology, is where I was going with that. In the studies, looking at how we're asking questions that talk about behavior and how people feel based on the situations that are going on with cancer and so forth. So what I think is important is that to tag on what Mrs. Panis said, was the stakeholders are involved and they have a seat at the table. So when we're talking about policy and how we're going to move the needle, to get this information disseminated, if you will, I think that this is a good conduit or a starting point, which this study, the Casidic study, regionally, within the 6 OECS islands, to really start moving that health psychology discussion and bringing it to all our stakeholders, both those in the ivory tower and those that we mentioned who are on the ground. So I think there's room for psychology to be more inclusive or included in health related research. And I think we just have to kind of invite Dr. James on board to be a stakeholder and to see how we can, because I think the information and the data that we're collecting is going to be valuable for a long time moving forward. So plug for the Casidic study. I hope I was supposed to do that.
Yeah, and I didn't mention, but there is a field of psychology called community psychology, one of the programs that I apply to that does exactly that. The whole basis of community psychology is working with communities to conduct research really targeted at addressing a social issue. And so a lot of that work is like qualitative work. A lot of the work is ethnographies, intervention design, program evaluation. And I think a lot of the field is adopting some of those like community psychological principles and values. And even in social psychology, we have kind of 2 social psychology organizations. And there's a history there, but anyway. And so there's like the traditional experimental social psychology organization that's all about like science and theory propagation and generation. I don't know if they do that these days, but I might get canceled. And then there's also the Society for the Study of Social Issues, which is mostly social psychologists really focused on addressing social issues. And you see the differences in how they, for example, responded to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This experimental social psych organization was like, not our problem. We don't make statements on issues. And SPICY was all like, human rights. And I'm on the SPICY Council, although I'm a trained experimental social psychologist, yeah. And so I try to toe the line and be that person who's like, hey, yes, and we need to do something about it. We can understand that this is about like theory generation as scientists, but what is theory without practice, right? Faith without work is dead. I remember my Catholic teachings. Yeah, I'm so bad. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Drexler, first and foremost, thank you for being here. Just being here is a lot, I find, St. Lucia doing this important seminar. So I'm not going to monopolize the questions so much because we're going to have time to talk afterwards. But, brilliant work from what I've seen this morning. And one little curiosity question. There's a lot of areas of psychology that were presented this morning, and you give a lot of local context. Now, we don't have any, unfortunately, policymakers on this morning, not that I'm aware of, maybe online. But if you were to make an informed decision as a son of the soil on, let's say I give you $1 million to put together some work, which area of psychology would you pinpoint first as a priority for St. Lucian context?
Oh God, I'm so biased. So,
You can only say social psychology.
I'll say, no, God. Oh, wow. Honestly, I think social psychology, like I know it's because social psychology just like addresses, and so social psychology, we focus on like group behavior, so how does like group imagine the actual presence of like individuals or groups influence like behavior, cognition. And I think that you can apply it to any context. You can apply it to the context of like education. You can apply it to the context of crime. You can apply it to the context of health. You can apply it to the context of like health behavior more specifically. And so I think that's like one way. I also think the other component is cultural psychology. And so I forgot to mention, I teach sociocultural psychology. And so I try to understand this like group when I teach students. I try to understand group processes embedded within cultural frameworks. And so as a St. Lucian, how do we interact as a group overlaid with like what it means to be a St. Lucian? I oftentimes think about like how Americanization has like shifted a lot of like group and individual dynamics in the St. Lucian context. And so, yes, the cultural component is important, but it's only as important as it informs how people engage and interact with others. And so because a lot of, for me, is like thinking about interaction, I'm like more tuned to thinking about social psychology. But if we're thinking in terms of like national priorities, naturally, I think mental health. And so I think there probably needs to be a large investment in mental health services. And so it becomes like a chicken or the egg. So do we not have a lot of like mental health services because of stigma of mental illness? So the stigma of, mental illness kind of lead to less investment in those mental health services. And so there's like two, but I think both of them can happen together. I think one can design interventions at the secondary school level. And a lot of these interventions are easy, well, not easy, but they do not require much resources, like psychoeducation, understanding, what do the average St. Lucian individual, the average young person in St. Lucia understand the cause of mental illness to be? Why might they be less likely to seek support? We saw in the presentation at the Caribbean Public Health Conference in the Bermudan context that school-age children tend to not want to go to a social worker, counselor, because the context is so small. So they don't trust the mental health care service providers because everyone knows everyone. And so you're not sure if you tell your counselor some deep-seated secret that they don't tell someone that you know or who may know you, or you might, feel uncomfortable walking in a grocery store and seeing your therapist. Or your therapist might be very close friends with like your first cousin. And so there are a lot of like those reasons. Or we know where doctors' offices are located. We know where the psychologists are located. Do people feel uncomfortable being seen going to seek mental health care services? Should we focus on building telehealth infrastructures in St. Lucia, given the context? And so should we offer therapy via Zoom or via telehealth? And is that the way that it should function, given the smallness of St. Lucia? So those are things that I think we should probably think about a bit more, and not directly translating the US or Western models, because St. Lucia just operates extremely different. And it's a function of just how small the island is and our history of colonialism and then neo-colonialism with Americanization. I see that as someone who lives in America.
Great response. So just one last remark. I just want to say personally, in terms of looking for therapists in St. Lucia, I do confirm that we don't have many choices. Even to find someone who, looks like me, as but as that may seem, is not necessarily evident, or who may have all the intersections that I'm looking for. So yeah, so I think that, but also a great, contribution.